Hello everyone. Today we are getting back to The Shining. Um, Unfortunately, it pains me to say that I don't have the benefit of being able to look down and see how long this video is, like you do. So I'm going to give you my best guess for what the length of it is going to look like. I am very determined to get us keep us pushing forward because we're not quite meeting the length that we would need to in order to be done with this book by the end of December, which is fine. It's going to go into January, but I see no reason to be comfortable with that. You know, I still want to keep pushing even though I know it's going to go into January. So I'm motivated to get a lot done today, but I've had a very long day. It's been full of activity and not all of it's been pleasant. So I don't imagine I have it in me to go for a super incredibly long time. I'm also starting this very late because I got home very late. So probably it will be a short one today, but you would know better than I would. So just letting you know that if it is a short one, that's expected. That's just how it worked out because I had a very, very adventurous and busy day. And I'm sleepy, and I have some hot chocolate. But it's not the super thick stuff that was making it hard for me to record. So hopefully it'll be nice and enjoyable. When we last left off, we were just a handful of pages out from finishing chapter 34, which is about Danny's paranormal experiences on the playground. And while those are fun and spooky, they don't seem to be super centric to the story. I mean, they reflect a little bit on. There's a little bit of a dramatic irony being drawn with Danny taking so much courage and his thoughts of what would my father do when his father experienced the same paranormal things that he's experiencing right now earlier, you know, but it's not a super complex chapter. It's mostly there to be scary and, you know, get us a little more on edge. And then the chapter after this one is called The Lobby. So let's go ahead and finish chapter 34. When he looked back again, the point line was only 5 feet behind. It was grinning. Its mouth was open, its haunches tensed down like a clock spring. Behind it and the others he could see the rabbit, its head now sticking out of the snow, bright green, as if it had turned its horrid blank face to watch the end of the stalk. Now on the Overlook's front lawn between the circular drive and the porch, he let the panic loose and began to run clumsily in the snowshoes, not daring to look back now, tilting further and further forward, his arms out ahead of him like a blind man feeling for obstacles. His hood fell back, revealing his complexion, paste white giving way to hectic red blotches on his cheeks, his eyes bulging with terror. The porch was very close now. Behind him he heard the sudden hard crunch of snow as something leaped. He fell on the porch steps, screaming without sound, and scrambled up them on his hands and knees, snowshoes clattering and askew behind him. There was a slashing sound in the air, and a sudden pain in his leg, the ripping sound of cloth, something else that must have been in his mind, a bellowing, angry roar. Smell of blood and evergreen. I'm sure you guys can hear my brother screaming at his computer while I record. That's fine. That's atmospheric. That's something that might happen in the Overlook Hotel. Let me respond to a message real quick. He fell full length on the porch, sobbing hoarsely, the rich, metallic taste of copper in his mouth. His heart was thundering in his chest. There was a small trickle of blood coming from his nose. He had no idea how long he lay there before the lobby doors flew open and Jack ran out, wearing just his jeans and a pair of slippers. Wendy was behind him. "Danny!" she screamed. "Doc! Danny, for Christ's sake, what's wrong? What happened?" Daddy was helping him up. Below the knee, his snow pants were ripped open. Inside, his woolen ski sock had been ripped open and his calf had been shallowly scratched, as if he tried to push his way through a closely grown evergreen hedge and the branches had clawed him. He looked over his shoulder. Far down the lawn, past the putting green, were a number of vague, snow-cowled humps. The hedge animals. Between them and the playground. Between them and the road. His legs gave way. Jack caught him. He began to cry. That's chapter 34. Alright, so that was the chapter where Danny had his encounter with the kid in the quote-unquote kid in the cement rings, and then with the hedge animals in a very close parallel to Jack's experience with the hedge animals. You know, the point there is sort of obvious. It's now we've had 3 people mention the hedge animals, counting Dick Halloran, so we kind of know that all 3 of them think that it was something that was just in their mind, but you know, it's obviously a shared experience. So that's kind of kooky. But let's get to chapter 35, the lobby. He had told them everything except what had happened to him when the snow had blocked the end of the concrete ring. He couldn't bring himself to repeat that. And he didn't know the right words to express the creeping, lassitudinous sense of terror he had felt when he heard the dead aspen leaves begin to crackle furtively down there in the cold darkness. But he told them about the soft sound of snow falling in clumps. About the lion with its head and its bunched shoulders working its way up and out of the snow to chase him. He even told them about how the rabbit had turned its head to watch near the end. The 3 of them were in the lobby. Jack built a roaring blaze in the fireplace. Danny was bundled up in a blanket on the small sofa where once, a million years ago, 3 nuns had sat, laughing like girls while they waited for the line at the desk to thin out. He was sipping hot noodle soup from a mug. Wendy sat beside him, stroking his hair. Jack had sat on the floor, his face seeming to grow more and more still, more and more set, as Danny told his story. Twice he pulled his handkerchief out of his back pocket and rubbed his sore-looking lips with it. Then they chased me, he finished. Jack got up and went over to the window, his back to them. He looked at his mommy. They chased me all the way up to the porch. He was struggling to keep his voice calm, because if he stayed calm, maybe they would believe him. Mr. Stenger hadn't stayed calm. He had started to cry and hadn't been able to stop, so the men in the white coats had come to take him away, because if you couldn't stop crying, it meant you lost your marbles. And when would you be back? No one knows. His parka and snow pants and the clotted snowshoes lay on the rug, just inside the big double doors. I won't cry, I won't let myself cry. And he thought he could do that, but he couldn't stop shaking. He looked into the fire and waited for Daddy to say something. High yellow flames danced on the dark stone hearth. A pine knot exploded with a bang and sparks rushed up the flue. Danny, come over here. Jack turned around. His face still had that pinched, deathly look. Danny didn't like to look at it. Jack, I just want the boy over here for a minute. Danny slipped off the sofa and came over beside his daddy. Good boy. Now, what do you see? Danny had known what he would see even before he got to the window. Below the clutter of boot tracks, sled tracks, and snowshoe tracks that marked their unusual exercise area, the snowfield that covered the overlook's lawn sloped down to the topiary and the playground beyond. It was marred by 2 sets of tracks, one of them in a straight line from the porch to the playground, the other a long, looping line coming back up. Only my tracks, Daddy, but what about the hedges, Danny? Danny's lips began to tremble. He was going to cry. What if he couldn't stop? I won't cry, I won't cry, I won't. All covered with snow, he whispered. But Daddy... What? I couldn't hear you. Jack, you're cross-examining him. Can't you see he's upset? Shut up! Well, Danny? They scratched me, Daddy, my leg. You must have cut your leg on the crust of the snow. Then Wendy was between them, her face pale and angry. What are you trying to make him do? She asked him. Confess to murder? What's wrong with you? The strangeness in his eyes seemed to break then. I'm trying to help him find the difference between something real and something that was only an hallucination. That's all. He squatted by Danny so that they were on eye-to-eye level, then hugged him tight. Danny, it didn't really happen, okay? It was like one of those trances you have sometimes, that's all. Daddy? What, Dan? I didn't cut my leg on the crust. There isn't any crust. It's all powdery snow. It won't even stick together to make snowballs. Remember, we tried to have a snowball fight and we couldn't. He felt his father stiffen against him. The porch step, then. Danny pulled away. Suddenly he had it. It had flashed into his mind all at once, the way things sometimes did, the way it had about the woman wanting to be in that gray man's pants. He stared at his father with widening eyes. You know I'm telling the truth, he whispered, shocked. Danny, Jack's face tightening. You know because you saw. The sound of Jack's open palm striking Danny's face was flat, not dramatic at all. The boy's head rocked back, the palm print reddening on his cheek like a brand. Wendy made a moaning noise. For a moment they were still, the three of them, and then Jack grabbed for his son and said, Danny, I'm sorry. Are you okay, Doc? You hit him, you bastard! Wendy cried. You dirty bastard! She grabbed his other arm, and for a moment Danny was pulled between them. Oh, please stop pulling me, he screamed at them, and there was such agony in his voice that they both let go of him, and then the tears had to come, and he collapsed, weeping, between the sofa and the window, his parents staring at him helplessly, the way children might stare at a toy broken in a furious tussle over to whom it belonged. In the fireplace, another pine knot exploded, like a hand grenade, making them all jump. Wendy gave him baby aspirin, and Jack slipped him, unprotesting, between the sheets of his cot. He was asleep in no time with his thumb in his mouth. I don't like that, she said. It's a regression. Jack didn't reply. She looked at him softly, without anger, without a smile either. You want me to apologize for calling you a bastard? All right, I apologize. I'm sorry. You still shouldn't have hit him. I know, he muttered. I know that. I don't know what the hell came over me. You promised you'd never hit him again. He looked at her furiously, and then the fury collapsed. Suddenly, with pity and horror, she saw what Jack would look like as an old man. She'd never seen him look that way before. What way? Defeated, she answered herself. He looked beaten. He said, I always thought I could keep my promises. She went to him and put her hands on his arm. All right, it's over. And when the ranger comes to check us, we'll tell him we all want to go down, all right? All right, Jack said. And at that moment, at least, he meant it. I'm getting fucking pop-ups. Hold on. The same way he always meant it on those mornings after, looking at his pale and haggard face in the bathroom mirror. I'm gonna stop. Gonna cut it off flat. But morning gave way to afternoon, and in the afternoons he felt a little better. And afternoon gave way to night. As some great 20th century thinker had said, night must fall. He found himself wishing that Wendy would ask him about the hedges, would ask him what Danny meant, when he said you know because you saw. If she did, he would tell her everything. Everything, the hedges, the woman in the room, even about the fire hose that seemed to have switched positions. But where did confession stop? Could he tell her he'd thrown the Magneto away? That they could all be down in Sidewinder right now if he hadn't done that? What she did say was, do you want a cup of tea? Yes, a cup of tea would be good. She went to the door and paused there, rubbing her forearms through her sweater. It's my fault as much as yours, she said. What we were doing while he was going through that dream, or whatever it was. Wendy, we were sleeping, she said. Sleeping like a couple of teenage kids with their itch nicely scratched. Stop it, he said. It's over. No, Wendy answered, and gave him a strange, restless smile. It's not over. She went out to make tea, leaving him to keep watch over their son. End of chapter 35. Well, that's a hell of an ending for a chapter. One sec. Alright. Chapter 36 is called The Elevator. Jack awoke from a thin and uneasy sleep, where huge and ill-defined shapes chased him through endless snowfields, to what he first thought was another dream. Darkness, and in it, a sudden mechanical jumble of noises, clicks and clanks, hummings, rattlings, snaps and whooshes. Then Wendy sat up beside him, and he knew it was no dream. What's that? Her hand, cold marble, gripped his wrist. He restrained an urge to shake it off. How in the hell was he supposed to know what it was? The illuminated clock on his nightstand said it was 5 minutes to 12. The humming sound again, loud and steady, varying the slightest bit, followed by a clank as the humming ceased, a rattling bang, a thump, then the humming resumed. It was the elevator. Danny was sitting up. Daddy? Daddy? His voice was sleepy and scared. Right here, Doc, Jack said. Come on over and jump in. Your mom's awake, too. The bedclothes rustled as Danny got in the bed between them. It's the elevator, he whispered. That's right, Jack said. It's just the elevator. What do you mean, just? Wendy demanded. There was an ice skim of hysteria in her voice. It's the middle of the night. Who's running it? Click. Clang. Above them now, the rattle of the gate, accordioning back, the bump of the doors opening and closing. Then the hum of the motor and the cables again. Danny began to whimper. Jack swung his feet out of bed and onto the floor. It's probably a short. I'll check. Don't you dare go out of this room. Don't be stupid, he said, pulling on his robe. It's my job. She was out of bed herself a moment later, pulling Danny with her. We'll go too. Wendy. What's wrong? Danny asked somberly. What's wrong, Daddy? Instead of answering, he turned away, his face angry and set. He belted his robe around him at the door, opened it, and stepped out into the dark hall. Wendy hesitated for a moment, and it was actually Danny who began to move first. She caught up quickly, and they went out together. Jack hadn't bothered with the lights. She fumbled for the switch that lit the four spaced overheads in the hallway that led up to the main corridor. Up ahead, Jack was already turning the corner. This time, Danny found the switch plate and flicked all three switches up. The hallway leading down to the stairs and the elevator shaft came alight. Jack was standing at the elevator station, which was flanked by benches and cigarette urns. He was standing motionless in front of the closed elevator door. In his faded tartan bathrobe and brown leather slippers with the run-down heels, his hair all in sleep corkscrews and alfalfa cowlicks, he looked to her like an absurd 20th century Hamlet, an indecisive figure so memorized by onrushing tragedy that he was helpless to divert its course or alter it in any way. Jesus, stop thinking so crazy. Danny's hand had tightened painfully on her own. He was looking up at her intently, his face strained and anxious. He had been catching the drift of her thoughts, she realized. Just how much or how little of them he was getting was impossible to say, but she flushed, feeling much the same as if he had caught her in some masturbatory act. Come on, she said, and they went down the hall to Jack. The hummings and clankings and thumpings were louder here, terrifying in a disconnected, benumbed way. Jack was staring at the closed door with feverish intensity. Through the diamond-shaped window in the center of the elevator door, she thought she could make out the cables, thrumming slightly. The elevator clanged to a stop below them at the lobby level. They heard the doors thump open, and... Party. Why had she thought party? The word had simply jumped into her head for no reason at all. The silence in the overlook was complete and intense, except for weird noises coming up the elevator shaft. Must have been quite a party. What party? For just a moment, her mind had filled with an image so real that it seemed to be a memory. Not just any memory, but one of those you treasure, one of those you keep for very special occasions and rarely mention aloud. Lights. Hundreds, maybe thousands of them. Lights and colors, the pop of champagne corks, a 40-piece orchestra playing Glenn Miller's In the Mood. But Glenn Miller had gone down in his bomber before she was born. How could she have a memory of Glenn Miller? She looked down at Danny and saw his head had cocked to one side, as if he was hearing something she couldn't hear. His face was very pale. Thump. The door had slid shut down there. A humming whine as the elevator began to rise. She saw the engine housing on top of the car first, through the diamond-shaped window, then the interior of the car, seen through the further diamond shapes made by the brass gate, a warm yellow light from the car's overhead. It was empty. The car was empty. It was empty, but on the night of the party, they must have crowded in by the dozens, crowded in the car way beyond its safety limit. But of course it had been new then, and all of them wearing masks. What masks? The car stopped above them on the third floor. She looked at Danny. His face was all eyes. His mouth was pressed into a frightened, bloodless slit. Above them, the brass gate rattled back. The elevator door thumped open. It thumped open because it was time. Time had come. It was time to say goodnight. Good night. Oh, yes, it was lovely. No, I really can't stay for the unmasking. Oh, early to bed, early to rise. Was that Sheila, the monk? Isn't that witty, Sheila coming as a monk? Oh, yes, good night. Thump! Gears clashed. The motor engaged. The car began to wind back down. Jack, she whispered. What is it? What's wrong with it? A short circuit, he said. His face was like wood. I told you it was a short circuit. I keep hearing voices in my head, she whispered. What is it? What's wrong? I feel like I'm going crazy. What voices? He looked at her with deadly blandness. She turned to Danny. Did you? Danny nodded slowly. Yes, and music, like from a long time ago, in my head. The elevator car stopped again. The hotel was silent, creaking, deserted. Outside, the wind whined around the eaves in the darkness. Maybe you are both crazy, Jack said conversationally. I don't hear a goddamn thing, except that elevator having a case of the electrical hiccups. If you two want to have duet hysterics, fine, but count me out. The elevator was coming down again. Jack stepped to the right, where a glass-fronted box was mounted on the wall at chest height. He smashed his bare fist against it. Glass tinkled inward. Blood dripped from two of his knuckles. He reached back and took out a key with a long, smooth barrel. Jack, no, don't. I am going to do my job. Now leave me alone, Wendy. She tried to grab his arm, but he pushed her backward. Her feet tangled in the hem of her robe, and she fell to the carpet with an ungainly thump. Then he cried out shrilly and fell on his knees beside her. Jack turned to the elevator and thrust the key into the socket. The elevator cables disappeared and the bottom of the car came into view in the small window. A second later, Jack turned the key hard. There was a grating, screeching sound as the elevator came to an instant standstill. For a moment, the declutched motor in the basement whined even louder, and then its circuit breaker cut and the overlook went unearthly still. The night wind outside seemed very loud by comparison. Jack looked stupidly at the gray metal elevator door. There were 3 splotches of blood below the keyhole from his lacerated knuckles. He turned back to Wendy and Danny for a moment. She was sitting up, and Danny had his arm around her. They were both staring at him carefully, as if he was a stranger they'd never seen before, and possibly a dangerous one. He opened his mouth, not sure what was going to come out. Wendy, it's my job, she said clearly. Fuck your job. He turned back to the elevator, worked his fingers into a crack that ran down the right side of the door, and got it open a little way. Then he was able to get his whole weight on it, and he threw the door open. The car stopped halfway, its floor at Jack's chest level. Warm light still spilled out of it, contrasting with the oily darkness of the shaft below. He looked in for what seemed like a long time. It's empty, he said then. A short circuit, like I said. He hooked his fingers into the slot behind the door and began to pull it closed. Then her hand was on his shoulder, surprisingly strong, yanking him away. Wendy! He shouted, but she had already caught the car's bottom edge and pulled herself up enough so that she could look in. Then, with a convulsive heave of her shoulder and belly muscles, she tried to boost herself all the way up. For a moment the issue was in doubt. Her feet tottered over the blackness of the shaft, and one pink slipper fell from her foot and slipped out of sight. Mommy! Danny screamed. Then she was up. Her cheeks flushed, her forehead as pale and shining as a spirit lamp. What about this, Jack? Is this a short circuit? She threw something, and suddenly the hall was full of drifting confetti, red and white and blue and yellow. Is this? A green party streamer, faded to a pale pastel color with age. And this? She tossed it out, and the rest came in the blue-black jungle carpet. A black silk cat's eye mask, dusted with sequins at the temples. Does that look like a short circuit to you, Jack? She screamed at him. Jack stepped slowly away from it, shaking his head mechanically back and forth. The cat's eye mask stared up blankly at the ceiling from the confetti-strewn hallway carpet. Oh, damn. End of chapter 36. Take a drink here. That was fucked up. Jack pretending he didn't see anything. Oh god, he's trying to keep it together. He doesn't trust his own eyes, but he most of all doesn't trust his family. You know what I mean? He doesn't want to admit what's going on. But he's really fucking himself over. Chapter 37. The Ballroom. It was the 1st of Dark Souls 3 December. Okay, sorry, it just says it was the 1st of December. Danny was in the East Wing ballroom, standing on an overstuffed, high-backed wing chair, looking at the clock under glass. It stood in the center of the ballroom's high, ornamental mantelpiece, flanked by 2 large ivory elephants. He almost expected the elephants would begin to move and try to gore him with their tusks as he stood there, but they were moveless. They were safe. Since the night of the elevator, he had come to divide all things into the Overlook into 2 categories. The elevator, the basement, the playground, room 17, and the presidential suite. It was suite, not sweet. He had seen the correct spelling in an account book Daddy had been reading at supper last night and had memorized it carefully. Those places were unsafe. Their quarters, the lobby, and the porch were safe. Apparently the ballroom was too. The elephants are, anyway. He was not sure about other places, and so avoided them on general principle. He looked back at the clock inside the glass dome. It was under glass because all its wheels and cogs and springs were showing. A chrome or steel track ran around the outside of these works, and directly below the clock face there was a small axis bar with a pair of meshing cogs at either end. The hands of the clock stood at 11:15, and although he didn't know Roman numerals, he could guess by the configuration of the hands at what time the clock had stopped. Okay, well I guess I was supposed to read that out as XI. The clock stood on a velvet base in front of it, slightly distorted by the curve of the dome. In the front of it, slightly distorted by the curve of the dome, was a carefully carved silver key. He supposed that the clock was one of the things he wasn't supposed to touch, like the decorative fire tools in their brass-bound cabinet by the lobby fireplace, or the tall china highboy at the back of the dining room. A sense of injustice and a feeling of angry rebellion suddenly rose in him, and never mind, what am I not supposed to touch? Just never mind. Touched me, hasn't it? Played with me, hasn't it? It had. It hadn't been particularly careful not to break him, either. Danny put his hands out, grasped the glass dome, and lifted it aside. He let one finger play over the works for a moment, the pad of his index finger denting against the cogs, running smoothly over the wheels. He picked up the silver key. For an adult, it would have been uncomfortably small, but it fitted his own fingers perfectly. He placed it in the keyhole at the center of the clock face. It went firmly home with a tiny click, more felt than heard. It wound to the right, of course, clockwise. Danny turned the key until it would turn no more, and then removed it. The clock began to tick. Cogs turned. A large balance wheel rocked back and forth in semicircles. The hands were moving. If you kept your head perfectly motionless and your eyes wide open, you could see the minute hand inching along toward its meeting some 45 minutes from now, within the hour hand at XII, and the Red Death held sway over all. He frowned and then shook the thought away. It was a thought with no meaning or reference for him. He reached his index finger out again and pushed the minute hand up to the hour. Curious about what might happen. Obviously it wasn't a cuckoo clock, but that steel rail had to have some purpose. There was a small, ratcheting series of clicks, and then the clock began to tingle Strauss's Blue Danube Waltz. I don't think that's how you pronounce that, but it goes da-da-da-da-da. A punched roll of cloth no more than 2 inches in width began to unwind. A small series of brass strikers rose and fell. From behind the clock face, 2 figures glided into view along the steel track. Ballet dancers. On the left, a girl in a fluffy skirt with white stockings. On the right, a boy in a black leotard and ballet slippers. Their hands were held in arches over their heads. They came together in the middle, in front of VI. Danny spied tiny grooves in their sides, just below their armpits. The axis bar slipped into these grooves, and he heard another small click. The cogs at either end of the bar began to turn. The Blue Danube tinkled. The dancer's arms came down around each other. The boy flipped the girl up over his head and then whirled over the bar. They were now lying prone, the boy's head buried beneath the girl's short ballet skirt. The girl's face pressed against the center of the boy's leotard. They writhed in a mechanical frenzy. Danny's nose wrinkled. They were kissing peepees. That made him feel sick. A moment later, and things began to run backward. The boy whirled the girl over the access bar. He flipped the girl into an upright position. They seemed to nod knowingly at each other as their hands arched back over their heads. They retreated just the way they had come, disappearing just as the blue Danube had finished. The clock began to strike a count of silver chimes. Midnight! Stroke of midnight! Hooray for masks! Danny whirled on the chair, almost falling down, but the ballroom was empty. Beyond the double cathedral window, he could see fresh snow beginning to sift down. The huge ballroom rug, rolled up for dancing, of course, a rich tangle of red and gold embroidery, lay undisturbed on the floor. Spaced around it were small, intimate tables for two, the spidery chairs that went with each, appended with legs pointing at the ceiling. The whole place was empty. But it wasn't really empty, because here in the Overlook things just went on and on. Here in the Overlook all times were one. There was an endless night in August of 1945, with laughter and drinks and a chosen shining few going up and coming down in the elevator, drinking champagne and popping party favors in each other's faces. It was a not yet light morning in June, some 20 years later, and the organization hitters endlessly pumped shotgun shells into the torn and bleeding bodies of 3 men who went through their agony endlessly. In a room on the second floor, a woman lolled in her tub and waited for visitors. In the Overlook, all things had a sort of life. It was as if the whole place had been wound up with a silver key. The clock was running. The clock was running. He was that key, Danny thought sadly. Tony had warned him, and he had just let things go on. I'm just 5, he cried to some half-felt presence in the room. Doesn't it make any difference that I'm just 5? There was no answer. He turned reluctantly back to the clock. He had been putting it off, hoping that something would happen to help him avoid trying to call Tony again. That a ranger would come, or a helicopter, or a rescue team. They always came in time on his TV programs. The people were saved. On TV, the rangers and the SWAT squad and the paramedics were a friendly white force counterbalancing the confused evil that he perceived in the world. When people got in trouble, they were helped out of it. They were fixed up. They did not have to help themselves out of trouble. Please? There was no answer. No answer, and if Tony came, would it be the same nightmare? The blooming, the petulant voice, the blue-black, rug-like snakes, red drum? But what else? Please, oh please. No answer. With a trembling sigh, he looked at the clock face. Cogs turned and meshed with other cogs. The balance wheel rocked hypnotically back and forth, and if you held your head perfectly still, you could see the minute hand creeping inexorably down from XII to V. If you held your head perfectly still, you could see that the clock face was gone. In its place was a round black hole. It led down into forever. It began to swell. The clock was gone, the room behind it. Danny tottered and then fell into the darkness that had been hiding behind the clock face all along. The small boy in the chair suddenly collapsed and lay in it at a crooked, unnatural angle, his head thrown back, his eyes staring sightlessly at the high ballroom ceiling. Down and down and down to the hallway, crouched in the hallway, and he'd made a wrong turn trying to get back into the stairs, and he had made a wrong turn, and now, he saw he was in the short, dead-end corridor that led only to the presidential suite, and the booming sound was coming closer, the roque mallet whistling savagely through the air, the head of it embedding itself into the wall, cutting the silk paper, letting out small puffs of plaster dust. God damn it, come out here, take your... But there was another figure in the hallway, slouched nonchalantly against the wall just behind him. Like a ghost. No, not a ghost, but all dressed in white. Dressed in whites, I'll find you, you goddamn little whore-mastering runt. Danny cringed back from the sound, coming up from the main third-floor hall now. Soon the owner of that voice would be around the corner. Come here, you little shit! The figure dressed in white straightened up a little, removed a cigarette from the corner of his mouth, and plucked a shred of tobacco from his full lower lip. It was Halloran, Danny saw, dressed in his cook whites instead of the blue suit he had been wearing on closing day. If there is trouble, Halloran said, you give me a call. A big loud holler like that one that knocked me back a few minutes ago. I might hear you even all the way down in Florida. And if I do, I'll come on the run. I'll come on the run. I'll come on the... Come now then. Come now. Oh, Dick, I need you. That's all we need. Run. Sorry, but I got to run. Sorry, Danny, old kid, old doc, but I got to run. It's sure been fun, you son of a gun, but I got to hurry. I got to run. No! But as he watched, Dick Halloran turned, put his cigarette back into the corner of his mouth, and stepped nonchalantly through the wall, leaving him alone. And that was when the shadow figure turned the corner, huge in the hallway's gloom, only the reflected red of its eyes clear. "There you are! Oh, now I've got you, you fuck! Now I'll teach you!" It lurched toward him in a horrible, shambling run, the rogue mallet swinging up and up and up. Danny scrambled backwards, screaming, and suddenly he was through the wall and falling, tumbling over and over, down the hole, down the rabbit hole, and into a land full of sick wonders. Tony was far below him, also falling. "I can't come any more, Danny. He won't let me near you. None of them will let me near you. Get Dick. Get Dick. Tony!" he screamed. But Tony was gone, and suddenly he was in a dark room. But not entirely dark. Muted light spilling from somewhere. It was Mommy and Daddy's bedroom. He could see Daddy's desk, but the room was a dreadful shambles. He had been in this room before. Mommy's record player overturned on the floor, her records scattered on the rug, the mattress half off the bed, pictures ripped from the walls, his cot lying on its side like a dead dog, the violent violet Volkswagen crushed to purple shards of plastic. The light was coming from the bathroom door, half open. Just beyond it, a hand dangled limply, blood dripping from the tips of the fingers. And in the medicine cabinet mirror, the word "Red Drum" flashing on and off. Suddenly, a huge clock in a glass bowl materialized in front of it. There were no hands or numbers on the clock face, only a date written in red. December 2. And then, eyes widening in horror, he saw the word "Red Rum" reflecting dimly from the glass dome, now reflected twice, and he saw that it spelled murder. Danny Torrance screamed in wretched terror. The date was gone from the clock face. The clock face itself was gone, replaced by a circular black hole that swelled and swelled like a dilating iris. It blotted out everything, and he fell forward, beginning to fall. Falling. He was falling off the chair. For a moment he lay on the ballroom floor, breathing hard. Red Rum. Murder. Red Rum. Murder. The Red Death held sway over all. Unmask! Unmask! And behind each glittering, lovely mask, the as-yet unseen face of the shape that chased him down these dark hallways, its red eyes widening, black and homicidal. He was afraid of what face might come to light when time for unmasking came around. "Dick!" he screamed with all his might. His head seemed to shiver with the force of it. "Dick! Oh, Dick, please, please, please come!" Above him, the clock had wound with the silver key. Above him, the clock he had wound with the silver key continued to mark off the seconds and minutes and hours. End of part 4. Uh-oh. As well as chapter 37. Let me take a quick break here. begin part 5 of The Shining. Matters of Life and Death. Chapter 38. Florida. Miss Halloran's third son, Dick, dressed in his cook whites, a Lucky Strike parked in the corner of his mouth, backed his reclaimed Cadillac limo out of its space behind the 1A wholesale vegetable mart, and drove slowly around the building. Masterton, part owner now but still walking with the patented shuffle he had adopted back before World War II, was pushing a bin of lettuces into the high, dark building. Halloran pushed the button that lowered the passenger side window and hollered, "Those avocados is too damn high, you cheapskate." Masterton looked back over his shoulder, grinned widely enough to expose all 3 gold teeth, and yelled back, "And I know exactly where you can put 'em, my good buddy." "Remarks like that I keep track of, bro." Masterton gave him the finger. Halloran returned the compliment. "You come back early tomorrow. I'm gonna give you some of the nicest new potatoes you ever seen." "I send the boy," Halloran said. "You coming up tonight?" "You supplying the juice, bro? That's a big 10-4. "I'll be there. Keep that thing off the top and going home, you hear me? Every cop between here and St. Pete knows your name." "You know all about it, huh?" Halloran asked, grinning. "I know more than you'll ever learn, my man." "Listen to this sassy N-word. Would you listen?" "Go on, get out of here before I start throwing these lettuces." "Go on and throw 'em. I'll take anything for free." Masterton made as if to throw one. Halloran ducked, rolled up the window, and drove on. He was feeling fine. For the last half hour or so, he'd been smelling oranges, but he didn't find that queer. For the last half hour, he'd been in a fruit and vegetable market. It was 4:30 p.m. EST, the first day of December. Old Man Winter settling his frostbitten rump firmly onto most of the country. Down here, the men wore open-throated short-sleeved shirts, and the women were in tight summer dresses and shorts. On top of the First Bank of Florida building, a digital thermometer bordered with huge grapefruits was flashing 79 degrees over and over. Thank God for Florida, Halloran thought, mosquitoes and all. In the back of the limo were 24 avocados, a crate of cucumbers, ditto oranges, ditto grapefruit. 3 shopping sacks filled with Bermuda onions, the sweetest vegetable a loving God ever created. Some pretty good sweet peas, which would be served with the entree and come back uneaten 9 times out of 10. And a single blue Hubbard squash that was strictly for personal consumption. Halloran stopped in the turn lane at the Vermont streetlight, and when the green arrow showed, he pulled out onto State Highway 219, pushing up to 40 and holding it there until the town began to trickle away into the ex-urban sprawl of gas stations, Burger Kings, and McDonald's. It was a small order today. He could have sent Decker after it, but Decker had been chafing for his chance to buy the meat, and besides, Halloran never missed a chance to bang it back and forth with Frank Masterton if he could help it. Masterton might show up tonight to watch some TV and drink Halloran's Bushmills, but he might not. Either way, it was alright. But seeing him mattered. Every time it mattered now, because they weren't young anymore. In the last few days, it seemed he was thinking of that very fact a great deal. Not so young anymore when you got up to near 60 years old, or tell the truth and save a lie, past it. He had to start thinking about stepping out. You could go any time. And that had been on his mind this week. Not in a heavy way, but as a fact. Dying was part of living. You had to keep tuning into that if you expected to be a whole person. And if the fact of your own death was too hard to understand, at least it wasn't impossible to accept. Why this should have been on his mind he could not have said, but his other reason for getting this small order for himself was so he could step upstairs to the small office over at Frank's Bar and Grill. There was a lawyer up there now, the dentist, who had been there last year had apparently gone broke, a young black fellow named MacIver. Halloran had stepped in and told this MacIver that he wanted to make a will, and could MacIver help him out? Well, MacIver asked, how soon do you want the document? Yesterday, Halloran said, and threw his head back and laughed. Have you got anything complicated in mind? Was MacIver's next question. Halloran did not. He had his Cadillac, his bank account, some $9,000, a piddling checking account, and a closet of clothes. He wanted it all to go to his sister. And if your sister predeceases you? MacIver asked. Never mind, Halloran said. If that happens, I'll make a new will. The document had been completed and signed in less than 3 hours. Fast work for a shyster, and now resided in Halloran's breast pocket, folded into a stiff blue envelope with the word will on the outside in Old English letters. He could not have said why he had chosen this warm sunny day when he felt so well to do something that he'd been putting off for years, but the impulse had come on him, and he hadn't said no. He was used to following his hunches. He was pretty well out of town now. He cranked the limo up to an illegal 60 and let it ride there in the left-hand lane, sucking up most of the Petersburg-bound traffic. He knew from experience that the limo would still ride as solid as iron at 90, and even at 120 it didn't seem to lighten much, but his screaming days were long gone. The thought of putting the limo up to 120 on a straight stretch only scared him. He was getting old. Jesus, those oranges smell strong. Wonder if they've gone over. Bugs splattered against the window. He dialed the radio to a Miami Soul station and got the soft, wailing voice of Al Green. He unrolled the window, pitched his cigarette butt out, and then rolled it further down to clear out the smell of the oranges. He tapped his finger against the wheel and hummed along under his breath. Hooked over the rear view mirror, St. Christopher's medal swung gently back and forth. And suddenly the smell of oranges intensified. And he knew it was coming. Something was coming at him. He saw his own eyes in the rear view, widening, surprised. And then it came all at once. It came in a huge blast that drove out everything else. The music, the road ahead, his own absent awareness of himself as a unique human creature. It was as if someone had put a psychic gun to his head and shot him with a .45 caliber scream. "Oh, Dick, please, please, please come!" The limo had just drawn even with a Pinto station wagon driven by a man in workman's clothes. The workman saw the limo drifting into his lane and laid on the horn. When the Cadillac continued to drift, he snapped a look at the driver and saw a big black man bolt upright behind the wheel, his eyes looking vaguely upward. Later, the workman would tell his wife that he knew it was just one of those N-word-y hairdos they were all wearing these days, but at the time it looked just as if every hair on that C-word's head was standing on end. He thought the black man was having a heart attack. The workman braked hard, dropping back into a luckily empty space behind him. The rear end of the Cadillac pulled ahead of him, still cutting in, and the workman stared with bemused horror as the long, rocket-shaped rear taillights cut into his lane no more than a quarter of an inch in front of his bumper. The workman cut to the left, still laying on his horn, and roared around the drunkenly weaving limousine. He invited the driver to the limo to perform an illegal sex act on himself, to engage in oral congress with various rodents and birds. He articulated his own proposal that all persons of his blood return to their native continent. He expressed his sincere belief in the position that the limo driver's soul would occupy in the afterlife, and he finished by saying that he believed he had met the limo driver's mother in a New Orleans house of prostitution. Then he was ahead and out of danger, and suddenly aware that he had wet his pants. In Halloran's mind, the thought kept repeating, "Come, Dick, please! Come, Dick, please!" But it began to fade off the way a radio station will as you approach the limits of its broadcasting area. He became fuzzily aware that his car was tooling along the soft shoulder at better than 50 miles an hour. He guided it back onto the road, feeling the rear end fishtail for a moment before regaining the composition surface. There was an A&W root beer stand just ahead. Halloran signaled and turned in, his heart thudding painfully in his chest, his face a sickly gray color. He pulled into the parking lot, took his handkerchief out of his pocket, and mopped his forehead with it. Lord God. "May I help you?" The voice startled him again, even though it wasn't the voice of God, but that of a cute little car hop standing by his open window with an order pad. "Yeah, baby, a root beer float. 2 scoops of vanilla, okay?" "Yes, sir." She walked away, hips rolling nicely beneath her red nylon uniform. Halloran leaned his back against the leather seat and closed his eyes. There was nothing left to pick up. The last of it had faded out between pulling in here and giving the waitress's order. All that was left was a sick, thudding headache, as if his brain had been twisted and wrung out and hung to dry. Like the headache he'd gotten from letting that boy Danny shine at him up there in Ullman's Folly. But this had been much louder. Then the boy had only been playing a game with him. This had been pure panic. Each word screamed aloud in his head. He looked down at his arms. Hot sunshine lay on them, but they still goosebumped. He had told the boy to call him if he needed help, and he remembered that. And now the boy was calling. He suddenly wondered how he could have left that boy up there at all, shining the way he did. There was bound to be trouble. Maybe bad trouble. He suddenly keyed the limo, put it in reverse, and pulled it back into the highway, peeling rubber. The waitress with the rolling hips stood in the A&W stand's archway, a tray with a root beer float on it in her hands. "What is it with you, a fire?" she shouted, but Halloran was gone. The manager was a man named Queens, and when Halloran came in, Queens was conversing with his bookie. He wanted the 4-horse at Rockaway. No parlay. No parlay, no quinella, no exacted, no goddamn futura. Just the little old 4, $600 on the nose. And the Jets on Sunday. What did he mean the Jets were playing the Bills? Didn't he know who the Jets were playing? 500, 7-point spread. When Queens hung up, looking put out, Halloran understood how a man could make $50 grand a year run in a little spa, and still wear suits with shiny seats. He regarded Halloran with an eye that was still bloodshot from too many glances into last night's bourbon bottle. I gotta fucking fix my computer's light filter problem. Problems, Dick? Yes, sir, Mr. Queens, I guess so. I need 3 days off. There was a package of Kents in the breast pocket of Queens's yellow shirt. He reached one out of the pocket without removing the pack, tweezing it out, bit down morosely on the patented micronite filter. He lit it with his desktop cricket. So do I, he said. But what's on your mind? I need 3 days, Halloran repeated. It's my boy. Queen's eyes dropped to Halloran's left hand, which was ringless. I've been divorced since 1964, Halloran said patiently. Dick, you know what the weekend situation is. We're full, to the gunnels, even the cheap seats. We're even filled up in the Florida room on Sunday night. So take my watch, my wallet, my pension fund. Hell, you can even take my wife if you can stand the sharp edges, but please don't ask for time off. What is he, sick? Yes, sir, Halloran said, still trying to visualize himself, twisting a cheap cloth hat and rolling his eyeballs. He's shot. Shot! Queen said. He put his Kent down on an ashtray which bore the emblem of Ole Miss, of which he had been a business admin graduate. Yes, sir, Halloran said somberly. Hunting accident? No, sir, Halloran said, and let his voice drop to a lower, huskier note. Jaina, she's been living with a truck driver, a white man. He shot my boy. He's in a hospital in Denver, Colorado. He's in critical condition. How the hell did you find out? I thought you were buying vegetables. Yes, sir, I was. He had stopped at the Western Union office just before coming here to reserve an Avis car at Stapleton Airport. Before leaving, he had swiped Western Union flimsy. Now he took the folded and crumpled blank form from his pocket and flashed it before Queen's bloodshot eyes. He put it back in his pocket and, allowing his voice to drop another notch, he said, Jane sent it. It was waiting in my letterbox when I got back just now. Jesus Christ, Queen said. There was a peculiar tight expression of concern on his face, one Halloran was familiar with. It was as close to an expression of sympathy as a white man who thought of himself as good with the coloreds could get when the object was a black man or his mythical black son. Yeah, okay, you get going, Queen said. Decker can take over for 3 days, I guess. The potboy can help out. Halloran nodded, letting his face get longer still, but he thought of the potboy helping out Decker, and it made him grin inside. Even on a good day, Halloran doubted if the potboy could hit the urinal on the first squirt. I want to rebate back this week's pay, Halloran said. The whole thing. I know what a bind this is putting you in, Mr. Queen, sir. Queen's expression got tighter still, and it looked as if he might have a fishbone caught in his throat. We can talk about that later. You go on and pack. I'll talk to Decker. Want me to make you a plane reservation? No, sir, I'll do it. All right. Queen stood up, leaned sincerely forward, and inhaled a raft of ascending smoke from his Kent. He coughed heartily, his thin white face turning red. Halloran struggled hard to keep his somber expression. I hope everything turns out, Dick. Call when you get a word. I'll do that. They shook hands over the desk. Halloran made himself get down to the ground floor and across to the hired help's compound before bursting into rich, bead-shaking laughter. He was still grinning and mopping his streaming eyes with the handkerchief when the smell of oranges came, thick and gagging, and the bolt followed it, striking him in the head, sending him back against the pink stucco wall in a drunken stagger. Please come, Dick, please! Come, quick! He recovered a little at a time, and at last felt capable of climbing the outside stairs to his apartment. He got the latchkey under the rush-plated doormat. When he reached down to get it, something fell out of his inner pocket and fell to the second floor decking with a flat thump. His mind was still so much in the voice that it shivered through his head that for a moment he could only look at the blue envelope blankly, not knowing what it was. Then he turned it over, and the word Will stared up at him in the black splattery letters. Oh my God, is it like that? He didn't know, but it could be. All week long the thought of his own ending had been on his mind like a go on, say it, like a premonition. Death? For a moment his whole life seemed to flash before him. Not in a historical sense, no topography of the ups and downs that Miss Halloran's third son, Dick, had lived through, but life as it was now. Martin Luther King had told them, not long before the bullet took him down to his martyr's grave, that he had been to the mountain. Dick could not claim that. No mountain. But he had reached a sunny plateau after years of struggle. He had good friends, he had all the references he would ever need to get a job anywhere. When he wanted fuck, why, he could find a friendly one with no questions asked and no big shitty struggle about what it all meant. He had come to terms with his blackness, happy terms. He was up past 60, and thank God he was cruising. Was he going to chance the end of that? The end of him? For 3 white people he didn't even know? But that was a lie, wasn't it? He knew the boy. They had shared each other the way good friends can't even after 40 years of it. He knew the boy, and the boy knew him, because they had a kind of searchlight in their heads, something they hadn't asked for, something that had just been given. Now, you got a flashlight. He's the one with the searchlight. And sometimes that light, that shine, seemed like a pretty nice thing. You could pick the horses, or like the boy had said, you could tell your daddy where his trunk when it turned up missing. But that was only dressing, the sauce and the salad. And down below there was a much bitter vetch in that salad that was there. And down below there was a much bitter vetch in that salad as there was cool cucumber. Oh, there was as much bitter vetch in that salad as there was cool cucumber. You could taste pain and death and tears. Now the boy was stuck in that place. And he would go. For the boy. Because, speaking of the boy, they had only been different colors when they used their mouths. So he would go. He would do what he could, because if he didn't, the boy was going to die right inside his head. But because he was human, he could not help a bitter wish that the cup had never been passed this way. She had started to get out and come after him. He had been dumping a change of clothes into an overnight bag when the thought came to him, freezing him with the power of the memory as it always did when he thought of it. He tried to think of it as seldom as possible. The maid, Dolores Vickery her name was, had been hysterical. Had said some things to the other chambermaids, and worse still, to some of the guests. When word got back to Ullman, as the sly quiff should have known it would do, he had fired her out of hand. She had come to Halloran in tears, not about being fired, but about the thing that she had seen in that second-floor room. She had gone into 217 to change the towels, she said, and there had been that Miss Massey, lying dead in the tub. That, of course, was impossible. Miss Massey had been discreetly taken away the day before, and was even then winging her way back to New York in the shipping hold instead of the first class she'd been accustomed to. Halloran hadn't liked Dolores much, but he had gone up to look that evening. The maid was an olive-complected girl of 23 who waited table near the end of the season when things slowed down. She had a small shining, Halloran judged, really not more than a twinkle. A mousy-looking man and his escort, wearing a faded cloth coat, would come in for dinner, and Dolores would trade one of her tables for theirs. The mousy little man would leave a picture of Alexander Hamilton under his plate. Had enough for the girl who had made the trade. But worse, Dolores would crow over it. She was lazy, a goof-off in an operation run by a man who allowed no goof-offs. She would sit in the linen closet reading a confession magazine and smoking, but whenever Ullman went on one of his unscheduled prowls, and woe to the girl he caught resting her feet, he found her working industriously, her magazine hidden under the sheets on a high shelf, her ashtray tucked safely in her uniform pocket. Yeah, Halloran thought she'd been a goof-off and a sloven, and the other girls had resented her, but Dolores had had that little twinkle. It always greased the skids for her. What she had seen in 217 had scared her badly enough that she was more than glad to pick up the walking papers Ullman had issued her and go. Why'd she come to him? A shine knows a shine, Halloran thought, grinning at the pun. So he had gone up that night and had let himself into the room, which was to be reoccupied the next day. He had used the office passkey to get in, and if Ullman had caught him with that key, he would have joined Dolores Vickery on the unemployment line. A shower curtain around the tub had been drawn. He had pushed it back, but even before he did, he'd see a premonition of what he was going to see. Miss Massey, swollen and purple, lay soggily in the tub, which was half full of water. He had stood looking down at her, a pulse beating thickly in his throat. There had been other things at the Overlook. A bad dream that reoccurred at regular intervals, some sort of costume party, and he was catering it in the Overlook's ballroom, and the shout to unmask everybody's exposed faces that were those of rotting insects. And there had been the hedge animals, twice, maybe 3 times. He had, or thought he had seen them move ever so slightly. The dog would seem to change from his sitting posture to a slightly crouched one, and the lion seemed to move forward, as if menacing the little tykes on the playground. Last year in May, Ullman had sent him to the attic to look for the ornate set of fire tools that now stood beside the lobby fireplace. While he had been up there, 3 light bulbs strung overhead had gone out, and he had lost his way back to the trap door. He had stumbled around for an unknown length of time, closer and closer to panic, barking his shins on boxes and bumping into things, with a stronger and stronger feeling that something was stalking him in the dark. Some great and frightening creature that had just oozed out of the woodwork when the lights went out. And when he had literally stumbled over the trapdoor's ring bolt, he hurried down as fast as he could, leaving the trap open, sooty and disheveled, with a feeling of disaster barely averted. Later, Ullman had come down to the kitchen personally to inform him he had left the attic trapdoor open and the lights burning up there. Did Halloran think the guests wanted to go up there and play treasure hunt? Did he think electricity was free? And he had suspected, no, he was nearly positive, that several of the guests had seen or heard things too. In the 3 years he had been there, the presidential suite had been booked 19 times. 6 of the guests who had put up there had left the hotel early, some of them looking markedly ill. Other guests had left other rooms with the same abruptness. One night in August of 1974, near dusk, a man who had won the Bronze and Silver Stars in Korea, that man now sat on the boards of 3 major corporations and was said to have personally pink-slipped a famous TV news anchorman, unaccountably went into a fit of screaming hysterics on the putting green. And there had been dozens of children during Halloran's association with the Overlook who simply refused to go into the playground. One child had a convulsion while playing in the concrete rings, but Halloran didn't know if that could be attributed to the Overlook's deadly siren song or not. Word had gone around among the help that the child, the only daughter of a handsome movie actor, was a medically controlled epileptic who had simply forgotten her medicine that day. And so, staring down at the corpse of Miss Massey, he had been frightened, but not completely terrified. It was not completely unexpected. The terror came when she opened her eyes to disclose blank silver pupils and began to grin at him. Horror came when she had started to get out and come after him. He had fled, heart racing, and had not felt safe, even with the door shut and locked behind him. In fact, he admitted to himself now as he zipped the flight bag shut, he had never felt safe anywhere in the Overlook ever again. And now the boy, calling, screaming for help. He looked at his watch. It was 5:30 p.m. He went to the apartment store, remembered it would be heavy winter now in Colorado, especially up in the mountains, and went back to his closet. He pulled his long sheepskin-lined overcoat out of its polyurethane dry cleaning bag and put it over his arm. It was the only winter garment he owned. He had turned off all the lights and looked around. Had he forgotten anything? Yes, one thing. He took the will out of his breast pocket and slipped it into the margin of the dressing table mirror. With luck, he would be back to get it. Sure, with luck. He left the apartment, locked the door behind him, and put the key under the rush mat and ran down the outside steps to the converted Cadillac. Halfway to Miami International, comfortably away from the switchboard where Queens or Queens' toadies were known to listen in, Halloran stopped at a shopping center and a laundromat and called United Airlines. Flights to Denver? There was one due out at 6:36 p.m. Could the gentleman make that? Halloran looked at his watch, which showed 6:02, and said he could. What about vacancies on the flight? Just let me check. A clinking sound in his ear, followed by Saturine Montevani, which was supposed to make being on hold more pleasant. It didn't. Halloran danced from one foot to the other, alternating glances between his watch and a young girl with a sleeping baby and a hammock on her back, unloading a coin-top Maytag. She was afraid she was going to get home later than planned, and the roast would burn, and her husband, Mike, Matt, would be mad. A minute passed. 2. He had just about made up his mind to drive ahead and take his chances when the canned-sounding voice of the flight reservations clerk came on. There was an empty seat, a cancellation. It was in first class. Did that make any difference? No. He wanted it. Would that be cash or credit card? Cash, baby, cash. I've got to fly. And the name was Halloran. 2 L's, 2 N's. Catch you later. He hung up and hurried toward the door. The girl's simple thought, worry for the roast, broadcasted him over and over until he thought he would go mad. Sometimes it was like that. For no reason at all, you would catch a thought, completely isolated, completely pure and clear, and usually completely useless. He almost made it. He had the limo cranked up to 80, and the airport was actually in sight when one of Florida's finest pulled him over. Halloran unrolled the electric window and opened his mouth at the cop, who was flipping up pages in his citation book. I know, the cop said comfortably. It's a funeral in Cleveland. Your father. It's a wedding in Seattle. Your sister. A fire in San Jose that wiped out your Gramps candy store. Some really fine Cambodian red just waiting in a terminal locker in New York City. I love this piece of road just outside the airport. Even as a kid, story hour is my favorite part of school. Listen, officer, my son is the only part of the story I can never figure out until the end, the officer said, finding the right page in his citation book, is the driver's license number of the offending motorist slash storyteller and his registration information. So be a nice guy and let me peek. Hallorann looked into the cop's calm blue eyes, debated telling his my son is in critical condition story anyway, and decided that would make things worse. This Smokey was no Queens. He dug out his wallet. Wonderful, the cop said. Would you take him out for me, please? I just have to see how it's all going to come out in the end. Silently, Hallorann took out his driver's license and his Florida registration and gave him to the traffic cop. That's very good. That's so good you win a present. What? Hallorann said hopefully. When I finish writing down these numbers, I'm going to let you blow up a little balloon for me. Oh, Jesus, Hallorann moaned. Officer, my flight. Shh, the traffic cop said. Don't be naughty. Hallorann closed his eyes. He got to the United desk at 6:49, hoping against hope that the flight had been delayed. He didn't even have to ask. The departure monitor over the incoming passenger's desk told the story. Flight 901 for Denver, due out at 6:36 EST, had left at 6:40, 9 minutes before. Oh, shit, Dick Hallorann said. And suddenly the smell of oranges, heavy and cloying. He had just time to reach the men's room before it came, deafening, terrified. Come, please, Dick, please, come! End of chapter 38. And end of tonight's session, because apparently I can't speak. Yeah, wow. Not only does that, I think, make a fantastic cliffhanger, not only did we get to cover some wonderful ground tonight and got to go over some of my favorite things that happened in this book, especially the little horrifying little scene with the elevator and Jack lying about it, and the little music box song and all that stuff. It's so good, and the reveal that Dick Hallorann is coming, all that stuff was wonderful. But I'm cutting it off now early, not because I'm tired, but because I had such a hard time getting through that chapter, and I tripped over nearly every sentence, and clearly my brain is not in reading mode tonight. So, unfortunately, this is going to be all we can get through, because if I go through another chapter, it's going to be more stuttering, more starting over, more misreading, and I really hate that with this book, because I feel like it really takes a lot of the, like, if it happens during scary parts, I feel like it really sucks a lot of the life out of the scary parts. So I just don't want to do it. I'm just going to go ahead and cut it off, and we will be back on Wednesday, the 22nd, and we'll be nice and refreshed. We'll be all prepared. I'll have everything. I'll be gathered, and I'll be ready, and I'll be hydrated, and we'll go from there. So, thank you for listening, if indeed you still are, and I'll see you then.